Streaming, streaming, rolling down the stream.
Just
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another BTR stream. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov, aka LevPo on Twitter, and today we're going to be talking about art, contemporary art, what's happening in art, what are the different trends, and we have a very small panel today, and I think that's a good thing because we're going to be able to be a lot more intimate, as it were, with the guests that we have. We have Benton C. Bainbridge to my left. We have the great Gino Panacchietti to my right. Below, we've got Jules. And, of course, we've got the great Distributist, a.k.a. Data Distribute on Twitter, to Jules's right. Thank you guys so much for being here today. And I just wanted to start with some introductions as far as where you guys come from in the art world, your relationship to art, and we'll start it from there. So let's go with Benton first.
Hi, everybody. My name is Benton. And first of all, thanks for having me, Lev and Jules. So I'm a video artist. Nowadays, they call me a media artist. And I say that I'm probably best known for using like hands-on techniques to make real-time video.
such as what kind of hands-on techniques?
All kinds of stuff. I say literally I'll use anything I can get my hands on, but right now I'm probably best known for using analog video synthesizers where you basically program them, but instead of typing code, you patch cables and turn knobs to create sort of custom looks and custom layering.
Cool.
And you've worked with people such as the Beastie Boys, who I remember dancing on the stage at a concert of theirs in Mount Airy Lodge when I was like 7 years old. So,
wow,
I definitely appreciate that. And we're both in SVA. I am an alumni of SVA, and you are teaching there in the MFA Computer Arts Department.
That's correct, yes. I teach a class called New Forms in Media. I say we don't really have a crystal ball, but it's sort of the crystal ball class where we look at what's happening with the very latest trends in technology for making and sharing art, and then try to extrapolate where things might go in the near future so that once the students leave the halls of School of Visual Arts, then they can maybe have a little bit of a head start if they're thinking ahead to where the trends are leading.
Cool. And Gio, tell us, you've been a frequent guest on our show, but for those who don't know you...
not much to explain. But... what would you call it? Edgy Twitter writer, artist, outsider artist, failed academic. Yeah, so everyone pretty much knows me. Art critic, amateur art critic.
What's that? What's edgy? Why do you consider yourself an edgy artist?
I come from, let's just say, what would you call it? Frog Twitter, distant right sphere, and a lot of my inevitably bleeds into my artwork. A lot of those sort of similar themes. But other than that, I don't consider myself that much of an edgelord, but merely someone who associates with, let's just say, outside of the cultural cathedral milieu, if you will. So I'm very much an outsider. I'm very much a, what would you say, for a cliched term, a born canceled artist in some ways. I mean, hey, I'd love to be in the institutions, but wouldn't we all? But I'm a creature of the online sphere, you could say.
And you said you were a failed academic, but you left, right? It's not like they...
No, I mean, I achieved 2 MAs, but I just didn't... I question the need to go further into academia in terms of an actual a PhD program.
Right, exactly.
But, and that's a possibility, who knows? But in this current climate, I find it highly unlikely unless I were to associate with certain institutions that are doing good work. But other than that, a lot of people are leaving academia now, and we could certainly talk about that, how even the art world is by an extension academia nowadays, and how those two institutions are changing to the point of I would say a crisis even. But anyways, that's me. Yeah. So.
And finally, we have the distributist.
Yeah, I'm not much of an artist. I just make video essays online. So
I'd say that's a very
I'm
important part of it.
I guess I'm interested in hearing people's opinions on art and new ways of possibly creating communities that consume art. I think is sort of the most important thing outside of the mainstream methods of creating and distributing art, which are usually through the universities or through a few elite circles inside urban areas. So I'd be very interested to hear what people are saying about that.
Well, this is definitely something that I wanted to get into today, as far as the difference between, just like the title of this thing, insider and outsider art, how these things are different and how the culture at large today is affecting both of them. So let's actually start with Benton, your perspective on what you're seeing right now as far as art in the, let's say, 2000s, 2010s. What are the cultural influences that have been driving it?
Well, that's a pretty vast, question. But what I would say is that, absolutely, where the technology doesn't determine the art, but artists will always jump on whatever the latest tools there are to use and to reach people. And generally, I would say that they're a bit ahead of where the audiences are. And so, as Lev, as you're very much involved in this world as well, I would say that one of the more interesting areas that is emerging right now is in the application of decentralization technology to media art.
I would agree. And I would be very interested in Distributus and Gio's take on the same question. What do you guys see as the cultures that are shaping the insider art as opposed to the ones that are shaping the outsider art?
Well, what do you mean by, do you mean insider art as in sort of the gallery system that exists inside metropolitan areas?
I would say that's pretty much as inside as you can get, so we can definitely use that as a good place to start.
I can't say I have very much experience with this world. I've lived most of my life inside urban areas, but I've never been somebody who's, for a while I knew people who own galleries in much smaller areas, but I don't know the people who do it these days. I mean, usually this is sort of a stereotype from 10 years ago. Usually there's this idea that you always want to be transgressing. I mean, that's a stereotype, but in my experience, it's been a true stereotype. But I don't know. I mean, the thing is that, what Western art's sort of been in that mode since the 70s, at least for larger things.
Sure. What do you mean about transgressing?
Well, what do you mean? Well, I guess it varies from person to person, but art galleries, at least again 10 years ago, the ones that were into this mode of there's a dominant culture, and good art had to sort of contest with the dominant culture for narrative space. Mm-hmm. And so a good piece of art was that which contested the dominant culture for narrative control. So if you went against something that was considered to be dominant in culture, then that was considered to be a brave piece of art. I'm thinking here of like Damien Hirsch's, Shark and Formaldehyde. There's another big one in the early 2000s where it was like someone's bed with like condoms strewn around it and stuff like that.
Tracy Emin,
the idea was that who did that again?
Tracy Emin.
Yeah. I mean, the idea was that these things were, transgressing the idea on what classically would be considered art that had some kind of craft to it. And that's, again, I don't know what it's going on now, but that's from a long time ago. That's sort of where it was.
Gio, would you agree? And also, by the way, Distributist, there's a bit of a weirdness going on in your audio where sometimes you're speaking good, but sometimes the audio just gets way too loud at certain intervals. I don't know if it's something with your computer.
Okay.
I was also curious about examples of those narratives, because you mentioned, you spoke about narratives, but I'm not sure how intuitive that is even to people familiar with art or like art current events. Like, what are examples of narratives that get gallery space or don't?
Well, the obvious one that gets gallery space are the standard narrative of like white privilege and oppression of minority groups. That was an incredibly popular theme, and from what I've seen currently, it's an incredibly popular theme now. As I keep on asking, is anyone's experience different? Because this is like, I'm giving you like 10-year-old like revelations, so.
Yeah, maybe I could jump in with like a current example. I recently, if you go to my blog, it's on Rocka Reviews. I wrote a very long, extensive review of one of the more upper echelon, very popular political art galleries recently at Downtown for Democracy. It was with a bunch of like the top feminist artists. It was called Abortion is Normal. And I basically wrote about how a lot of these narratives, they haven't changed in a lot of ways, but also they're manifesting a certain almost quasi-occultic spirituality that is secularized for a political aim to them. Like I'm referring to artists like Marilyn Minter, Cindy Sherman, a lot of these big names. They seem to still continue forth with what Distributist was talking about with this transgression. I would also want to know Distributist's opinion, because I've watched a lot of your work.
Thank you.
When we talk about the art world, maybe we could also include what would be considered, for lack of a better term, culture industry avenues like video games, movies, because you have done many series where you've critiqued a lot of these things. I watched your recent video, for example, about this Joss Whedon film and how
Dr. Horrible.
Yeah, Dr. Horrible. Maybe you could comment on that. How
that was Neil Patrick Harris.
With Neil Patrick Harris, where he's like the nerd villain, but now it's problematic nowadays. So
unbelievable. I remember learning about that when I worked at Sharp Independent. He was the producer of Boys Don't Cry, Proof, that math film with Anthony Hopkins. Mm-hmm. He turned me on to Dr. Horrible. I remember that was like a big deal, viral video when it first came out. I can't believe people still talk about it.
Well, I think, it was very popular for my generation. It was a new thing, about 10 years ago. And it was an artifact of the writer's strike. So it's not, I don't know exactly how relevant it was, but it does show, I guess it's kind of odd that a 10-year-old movie that was considered hip 10 years ago is now problematic and something that, you never see now, which I guess indicates how fast the culture is moving. We're kind of in a unique space.
Benton, do you notice the culture moving in that much more extreme direction compared to what it was, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago?
Extreme in what sense?
Well, that is relative. So let's say if we're talking about, I don't really know what the best example here would be, even though there are many. Let's say, for example, the quote-unquote woke culture, as it's said, where people have to be very careful the things that they say and the ways that they say it, or else they would be perceived to be racist, bigots, homophobes, and that's resulted in cancel culture and people's careers getting ruined. And that, I would say, is the biggest example that's pretty naked right now. That's
changed since a decade ago? Yeah, I would definitely say that's absolutely that we're in a very different era of awareness. As far as like being careful about it, I don't know. I guess I would say that personally, like, I'm thrilled to see people re-examining these ideas. And as far as I'm concerned, if there's a few statues of George Washington that end up coming down alongside the Confederate statues, oh well, so be it. I mean, let's examine our past and with the goal of changing our present, because most definitely one thing that 2020 has made crystal clear to us is just how unequal this country remains.
Aren't you concerned?
Wait, Jules, let Distributist, yeah?
Sure, I was.
Aren't you concerned that a society that stares statues down will also be censoring new works of art coming up?
No, not really.
You're not.
It's not, tearing statues down is like, I just see it as what is it like when statues?
You said tearing statues down is like something, and I don't know what you mean.
Oh, okay. Yeah, to me, like if that's the collateral damage, of like some cataclysmic change that results in righting some like 400-year injustices, so be it. Like there's a part of me that, like I came out of punk, and my influences were like early hip hop, punk, noise, and like, if a little bit of if somebody gets their egos get bruised a little bit or whatever, I gotta say it's probably okay. Like this conflict to me, I actually see as very positive in the balance, because the alternative of just letting all this continue to simmer is far worse.
What good things do you see coming out of this?
Well, so I just drove across country. So I live in New York, in the Bronx, and I was too afraid to fly because what I have noticed is that not everybody takes the potential for infection as seriously as I do. And so I decided to drive across the country. I was also frankly interested in just seeing where people are at, right? So I stopped in a number of places, but I'll just highlight a couple of stops I made. So I stopped I started in New York, of course, and I shot protests. I attended protests in New York, DC, and in Denver along the way. And overall, like what I would say is that it's encouraging, actually. It's hopeful to see people actually out on the streets and to continue to be coming out on the streets every day. So, I saw very little evidence actually of, rioting and looting and whatnot. I did see graffiti on walls of buildings and banks and whatnot, but I myself didn't actually see statues being torn down. But I guess what I would say is that, revolution is what this country is about. And so it's time for a change. So I'm thrilled to see the people getting out. And
do you see this as the first step of a revolution?
Say that again.
Do you see this as the first step of a revolution?
I don't know if I'm actually really qualified to say that, because I'm an artist. I'm not a politician. I'll definitely say that there's an artistic revolution going on as far as I'm concerned, because you were speaking of the prevailing modes of, say, a decade or 2 decades ago. I see everything is really in the process of a radical change right now. And that change is that people, I see that a lot of younger artists are really concerned with like making work themselves, with doing it with their hands, with building smaller works. Like things like craft have come back in a way that was unimaginable just a few years ago. And so maybe it's tied with like so many people I hear like taking up gardening and whatnot during the pandemic. I think that we're going to see a return to people actually getting their hands dirty, making work. Whereas to me, the predominant mode that includes that mode you're talking about of basically creating a narrative that's supposed to be a counter narrative to what's the prevailing modes are. But what I saw as the predominant mode is that it was about ideas, and that the artist, quote unquote, didn't actually make the work necessarily. And that's what I see personally is really changing. And it's happening all over, everywhere.
People political ideas or not political ideas, I guess.
Well, I'm speaking about art again. So
you're saying that the Jeffrey Koons of the world, they're sort of like the past. They're by the wayside.
The way, well, what I again, I'm not going to pronounce judgment on his career, but what I'll say is that his work, a lot of what the premise is of this work is that it is of an extremely high production value that can only be executed by a large industrial enterprise, right? But I think now with, say, 7-year-olds, certainly by 7, you at least know what a 3D printer is, and chances are you've even actually already played with 3D software. And so the miracle of someone who can make these large puppies, that are like balloon puppies, it's still high production value, mind you, but it's going to become less and less amazing that can be done, right? So people are going to start turning more. Young people are extremely visually sophisticated, and you can't just show them something slick and just say okay, I'm a great artist. That they know a lot more about what goes into the technology of making art, and that is pushing us in a different direction, in my opinion.
Well, that's as far as technology goes, but as far as, let's say, John Gonzalez, who is an expat from Venezuela, who's joining us in the chat over here, and we had a great talk with him as well before, so he asked, so it's like a cultural change. And I think this is what people care about right now, on whatever side you happen to be, what the cultural revolution, I guess, would be here. Because when I am thinking of you talking about revolution, one of the first things that comes into my head as far as the destroying of the new and the destroying of the old and the enacting of the new are the Maoist Red Guards, whose mission was to completely annihilate whatever history, they were also destroying the statues, they were destroying any trace of the Confucian old Chinese history and replacing it with something else. So what do you think when it comes to a person's idea of who they are in this space, how that has changed today, let's say, as an artist, as somebody who has something to contribute to the world, when you are, let's say, when you go to school, there are certain things that you would learn about yourself based on the identity that you have. So, for example, if there's all this talk about white privilege, and we have a lot of white people who are kneeling down and who are, just going on the ground, there seems to be something very religious about it, something akin to original sin, that my concern is going to generate on both ends of the spectrum a lot of negative side effects. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on that part of it.
Me? Were you asking?
Yes, but I would love to get everybody's take as well.
You're asking me?
I am asking. Oh, actually, let's start with you, and then we're gonna go to Benton, and then Gio.
Well, I guess I'm obviously more skeptical of the current going-ons of 2020 as being a productive force. It seems like, I don't know. I'm seeing sort of a contraction of the ideas space. There's more and more things that you can't talk about. And I usually associate things that contract the ideas space to things that contract the artistic space. The example you gave of Mao's Cultural Revolution is a great example. Mao's Cultural Revolution totally closed the Chinese mind to any new ideas for about 2 decades. And it wasn't an actual revolution. The economic and political power structures that ruled China were more or less the same before as they were afterwards. It's just that they took all of the old ideas and destroyed them, And then they use the cultural hegemony generated by that event to essentially keep out a lot of new ideas. And I'm not wondering if that's the same mistake we're making right now. I would absolutely love to see a return to actual craftsmanship in the wake of the pandemic and the other problems we've had in 2020. I really want to be optimistic, and I'm no fan of the status quo. I hated the status quo before 2020. But I think that, change is not always good. And I'd have to see some more evidence that this particular change we're undergoing is actually good in some productive way. And not simply that it's against the status quo that's bad for any number of reasons.
Before Benton and Gio go on, I just want to say that there is still a lot of problem with your audio where you speak for 5 seconds and it's low and then it just gets high and then gets low again.
Okay. Let me try to plug it out and plug it back in again. I'll come back.
Thank you. So Benton, what do you think of what a distributor said?
I guess what I would say is probably worth making crystal clear that I'm actually not pro censorship. Part of the reason, and Lev, you and I have touched upon this, and this is a ongoing concern within the decentralized art community, but part of my interest is actually preserving culture, including preserving statues, even statues of people who, were horrible people. The question is one of, what we put in the public sphere, right? And so what I would say is anything can be talked about, and there should be spaces for people to say literally anything. But at the same time, I think that, just as we need to have the freedom to speak, the freedom of speech, then we also have to accept the consequences of what we might say, right? So this is a big thing to try to summarize, but what I would say is, my feeling is that I agree with distributors that there's a massive downside to a lot of the change that's happening. And what I think is that to some degree, it's already happening. We're going to see a fracturing, a splintering of this society, which is, it's a big country. And again, I just drove across the country, and the attitudes from region to region, and people just simply think differently, right? There's not a homogenous attitude in this country. And it's possible that maybe we might find that America can't contain all these disparate viewpoints and ideas and attitudes about what's right. Just as one example, when I was driving through in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, the radio was pretty much dominated in one spectrum of the FM dial by Christian radio stations. And, they were acknowledging that there are things that the protesters have things that we have to work on, but they were ultimately like, well, you know what? Trump is making progress on abortion, and that's what's most important to us, So maybe we can't encompass this wide range of ideas about what's the most important legally, morally, aesthetically, right, in one country. I don't know.
Well, to me, the thing that's always been troubling is not so much in the countryside, where there are going to be a lot of more local values, if you will, but more in the urban settings, because I think of myself as a New Yorker. Other than coming here from St. Petersburg, Russia, I've always been a New Yorker, and I love so many things about it. But I don't want to live in the world where everything could be perceived as possibly being bigoted just because somebody on Twitter with a loud mouth is going to complain about whatever sets them off. And my fear is that
do your thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have that fear though? Because I don't have that.
I don't have that fear for myself. I don't have that fear for myself. I have that fear for, let's say, a lot of the institutions through a Chinese through like a Chinese water torture boiling frog scenario would eventually get to the point where more and more things that we consider to be productive discourse is going to be taken away from us for the sake of making sure nobody gets offended.
But what's the difference between that and what's acceptable conversation at home? Like there are subjects anywhere you go. It could be school, it could be home, it can be with your wife. Certain conversations are really going to upset people.
Well, I think
that is always the case. Like for me, a big part of freedom of speech is when they start taking away your bank accounts or
they're already doing
arrested.
that.
They already have, yeah.
So they have done that.
So I think those are the real red flags as far as the climate changing to people are very sensitive about 9/11 jokes. You know, you have people now 10 years later making 9/11 jokes like the Young Turks, and it's, you know, it's a different climate. Like people can get very upset about things that in other circumstances they won't be.
I think
we always have to be sensitive to people and be situationally aware. Like to me, I don't know how to wish that away.
In some respects, I think there is a trend towards decentralization. Certainly, I'm very much what you would consider a traditional artist because I'm doing painting, I'm doing block printing, wood block, and things like that, using very traditional techniques. But a lot of inevitably, my work is inspired by the internet. But the problem is that, and I believe the Distributus has also touched on this, the trend towards centralization in technology and social media and the sort of, what would you call it, the Californian ideology has sort of soured over the decades. And now we're left with an internet that isn't this promised land of a great frontier, but rather it's being conglomerated within a few payment processors and social media sites and Google algorithms. I mean, even just to do research papers, being an essayist myself, like it's almost impossible to find dissident sources or sources that are inconvenient to whatever woke narrative that's going on at the time. And so the problem itself is the discourses and the images of thought within the systems that the people that run these systems of techno capital, what they believe in to be right is not even necessarily conspiratorial, but it's just the way that a lot of these people operate within their given space. And we all know, I mean, from people who have spilled the beans in the environment of what it's like in Silicon Valley, they have to go along with certain programs. They have to put, corporations have to put the black square, BLM, and this is creating what we've touched upon, a quasi-religious fervor, one that I would say is a secular appropriation of religious right. What did Moldbug call it? The Church of No Salvation. And it's funny I mentioned Moldbug because today I was watching his Hermetics interview, which was very enlightening.
That was great.
Where he talks about, how if you let this thing go on and they'll eventually run out of steam, and it's like the communist country, it's like the Czech Republic back in the day. In the 1950s, you could get your head chopped off if you were a dissident, but by the 1970s, nobody cared anymore because you just joined the Communist Party to get a job. I think that's sort of optimistic, but I do think he has a point. I think these institutions, whether it's the art world or academia or the culture industry with its Hollywood or the video game industry, I mean, The Last of Us 2, I mean, literally 90% critic rating, 4% user rating. It's these institutions, I think there's a trend towards collapse, but the problem is they still have a capacity to, if I may be frank, fuck people over who are dissidents in the interim before the joke is over, before the quote unquote normie gets hip to the fact that a lot of these institutions are carrying unwarranted self-important power and that they have the ability to censor. I know artists myself who have been censored, Diana Havas and people like that. So I think that as much as you want to be optimistic, much as you want to be quote unquote clear-pilled, I think that for the next few decades, things are going to get progressively more grim and things are going to get progressively more centralized within certain structures, and people will have their payment processors destroyed and their ability to even put food on their table just deleted, more or less, because if the whole world is digital now, I mean, as much as I love digital technology, as much as I use it, I'm very much of that Ted Kaczynski mindset that the more you let it manifest, the more you let, like Lewis Mumford said, the more you let authoritarian techniques take over, then you're going to have a system that's totally reliant on these technologies and the people that run them. So,
Gio,
sorry, I'm just ranting right now.
No, Gio, that was really beautiful. I wanted to ask, do you see a difference between the solidarity movements that are trendy every now and then, in a way similar to like patriotism? Like is patriotism like similarly a religious fervor? Or
well,
is that a different type of solidarity?
I want to touch on one quick thing about that, which is that during the 30s and 40s, and the Moldbug touches on this as well, I highly recommend everybody to read this wonderful book, Eugene Lyon's The Red Decade, which talks about how during the 30s and 40s, it was cool to be communist, but not just communist, but Stalinist. And all the communists who were not Stalinists were talked about being like crypto-fascists, you know, and were highly denounced until those communist agents were able to infiltrate them, and then it became one big happy family. So if you were going around like all the hip New York City social circles at that time, you would have to profess your love towards Stalin's empire, or else you would have been seen as the odd man out. And that is another example of this kind of stuff repeating through history. And my concern is that, like Benton, the people who are within our circle, I think that there are so many people who have a great heart, who want people to get along, you know, just live and create beautiful works. My concern, though, is that if there are certain things that they see as impeding on their freedom, they would not be able to say anything lest they be seen as the odd person out in this case. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, as well as what Gio talked about in this more, I guess, blackpilling way as far as what awaits us in the next several years.
I think it's absolutely important that we think about these digital spheres, because obviously we live as much in a digital reality as we do in a physical reality. I mean, if that's something, that's another thing that obviously has been so catalyzed in the during the pandemic in 2020. So I absolutely agree that these are things that we need to think about. I frankly am skeptical about you know, I don't personally see, like, just the fact that, you know, like people can, okay, here's an example, right? Lev, you know, to your point about New York, the hipster elite kind of circles, like, you know, someone came to buy an old cell phone from me the other day in the Bronx, and he was wearing like a Trump hat, Trump baseball hat and whatnot. So, you know, the reality is that, like, there are divergent voices, and it's just there's not like a central control over the technologies at this time where you could point to it and say, like, there is one prevailing attitude that dominates, you know, all of, you know, that is like in control of these digital spheres. As an example, I would just point to that, like, Mark Zuckerberg has been extremely reluctant to take down any of Trump's ads. And then it's only, what, 3 days ago that he finally took one down. So and to the point about money, I guess what I would say is, like, what I see happening, and I think everybody, this is one of the reasons I've been interested in decentralization technology personally, is again, that there is such a divergent range of attitudes about what is right. I mean, basic questions of, like, the morality of life and death, right? That are very different depending on one's viewpoint. And Neil Stephenson, he predicted in the Diamond Age that basically what would happen in the future is that we would separate society no longer along lines of geography or nation states. It would be, society globally would be separated along ideological lines. And wherever you would go in the world, you would be basically just communing with the people who shared the ideas that you have. I'm not saying this is a utopian idea, mind you, but this is an interesting, valid idea, because I do see evidence of us moving that way. So as long as, you know, I was in the Soviet Union, Lev, in 87 and 89.
That's 1 year before I was born.
And Leningrad at that time, like, you know, well, actually, I saw in Leningrad, I met more artists. And then in Moscow, I met these sort of black market traders, right? And the reality is that people, we have certain basic needs, and those basic needs will find a way to fulfill them, hopefully, one would hope, right? And then in the case of late communism in the Soviet Union, there were lines, just like during pandemic, there were lines around the block to like get your bread and whatnot, right?
Definitely.
And so people, they created black and gray markets to fill their needs. And so I guess what I would say is, you know, I don't know, instead of us whining about it, maybe we should just create our own communities and you know, become self-sufficient.
John Gonzalez.
We're not all going to share a gift.
By the way, John Gonzalez from Venezuela writes, "Sounds like my home, ha ha ha." And yeah, I guess those two things do have that in common. What I would say, though, is that I don't know if you know this, but during those times, like the 70s and the 80s, they were sending the artists who you talked with to mental homes and forcibly drugging them to such an extent that it would destroy their mind as a warning to the others. So it wasn't just a matter of you being able to live as an outsider. To Moldbug's point about places in Eastern Europe where, sure, like you could get fired but nothing bad would happen, I don't know if those places had those psychiatric horror shows as Russia had, but that was certainly a bad experience for people living in it. And I could imagine, I mean, maybe I'm stretching it, you tell me, but I could imagine there are some, you know, very extreme, very left-leaning people out there who imagine that conservatives are so evil that you have to put them in camps, that you have to perform.
Like you mean like the Bob Chipmans of the world that think that they should have all the power and like, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, yes, as far as giving people not that much of a choice as far as you could live on the outskirts and express your art, but that you would have to take a pill. You would have to be forced to adopt this mindset, you know, or else we're going to force it on you, you know, through physical means.
My question is, what is the forcing that's happening here? I mean, you know, again, our president is definitely of the conservative side, and, you know,
yes,
but okay, he's certainly not a traditional conservative. Okay, good.
Sure.
That, but,
yeah.
So can people hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think I'll try to speak straight into the microphone. If I took the guard off, that might be interfering. I think what people mostly are talking about when they're talking about institutional opposition to dissident voices in this contemporary environment is the participation of things like banks and social media and essentially HR departments that go out of their way to essentially punish dissident opinions. If we were, I mean, I guess you could go full Amish, but short of that, people need income streams, they need banks, they need the ability to actually function in society if they're going to have an independent voice. And if everything works along one ideological dimension, basically the same ideological dimension as Black Lives Matter, they uniformly support it, then it doesn't really matter who's the president. Most of the power is contained within corporate bodies and within HR bodies and within academic and other consensus-making bodies like the media, which are basically entirely in progressive hands at this stage.
Well, distributors, I have to strongly disagree there. The unbanked are not like, you know, opponents of Black Lives Matter. The unbanked are blacks. That's who's unbanked. So, you know, I live in the Bronx, and I've got to say there's like a lot of cash transactions there. You know, the reality is that, you know, again, I see evidence of it all over the place. Driving across the United States of America is really interesting because you hear on Christian radio, you hear that there are just entire economies that are set up to serve people of that ideological mindset. You know, like a pool and spa company like that was saying, hey, we have great deals for the summer, blah, blah, blah.
I'm not talking about pool and spa companies. I'm talking about banks, and I'm talking about the ideology of large
companies.
Internet. So for instance, they're essentially Google demonetized Zero Hedge in the Federalist just a few days ago. And, I sympathize with people not being able to get loans in poor communities, but the story has to become more sophisticated than conservatives own the banks, because Bank of America, which is one of the largest personal loan banks, to my knowledge, in this country, gave billions to Black Lives Matter. Now, if it is nefariously hurting the African American community at the same time as it's making these donations, that might be the case. But the story has to be something beyond. It just doesn't follow progressive ideology hard enough. It obviously does.
Well, we should all be using credit unions. We shouldn't be using banks anyways. I mean, credit unions are the only way to go. Again, I would say that we should be banking for ourselves. We should basically be creating the infrastructure, acknowledging that, not everybody's going to feel the way we do. I don't feel the same way as a lot of people. I have a different range of experiences, perhaps, and I know we all do here, but so I think that I'm not really concerned. I would personally like to see, I'm just as happy with everything being torn down, and it's just having smaller communities that we work within, that we trade within, and then figuring out ways between the communities, say, what happens between different blockchains, for example. We can all have our own currencies and just trade between blockchains, as far as I'm concerned, because I don't see us bridging some ideological gaps. I just don't even think it's possible.
So in other words, you would say patchwork and other, yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Strudis.
I think that this is sort of music to my ears, to be quite honest. I mean, I've heard a lot of people talk about the Diamond Age. The Diamond Age is sort of a quintessentially, a lot of reactionaries frame that as a key science fiction vision of a reactionary future. If the left and the right is in agreement that we need to have something like patchwork, I think that we could do a lot of positive things in that direction. But right. I'd have to see some motions from the left on this regard. It can't be like patchwork for us, patchwork for me. We get to have our autonomous zone. But then, the second someone does something like that in Montana, we said the ATF in and burn the compound down or something like that.
Or Waco. Yeah, they get Waco.
They can't. It also can't be like we search out conservative activists, go after their employment and slash their accounts, as happened to Brittany Sellner recently. Or I think it was about 6 months ago. So we have to have some good faith. I mean, we still live in a global economy, and it can't be like, oh, we're going to do patchwork, but progressives still control 100% of the global institutions, and they use that control to punish their ideological enemies. That's not patchwork. That is sort of a patchwork with the scale essentially tilted in one dimension.
If I may jump in, I think. I don't. Again, I don't want to sound like a fanboy, but Distributus, you did a really great series about the history of YouTube right before you had a little hiatus, right?
Kind of. It's not as much of a hiatus as I thought, but yeah.
What I found interesting to bring this to sort of relevancy of what we're talking about, whether it's the art world or let's just say the content production, because I firmly believe in good content. That's my motto, because I do so many things between writing and painting. I think when you look at, for example, and as much as I absolutely detest a lot of these post-Gamergate people, because I think they were a bunch of ineffective grifters, but that's my own personal bias. I think when you examine sort of the post-Gamergate order of, in particular, YouTube and YouTubers, a lot of them started off, at least in the interim, organically, and they grew their own audience through just sheer posting alone. And of course, they canceled themselves and they became grifters, and they had a bunch of armies of Jannies and carrier pigeons and so forth.
Wait, what are carrier pigeons? I'm sorry to interrupt, but you always use carrier.
Carrier pigeons are sort of like when the e-celebrity can't send out a message to people, so they have like go-betweens that, like, for example, V with Sargon, he has to like go out there and send the message out, right? So but my point being is that a lot of these people, despite their flaws, huge flaws, they started off organically as a movement onto themselves, and they sort of embodied that almost proto-punk DIY spirit. But then, now that there has been a vacuum in YouTube, and Distributed Series points this out, how a lot of these people went by the wayside. They're no longer in YouTube. I mean, let's face it, a lot of their content became stale and so forth. It seems that now BreadTube or leftist YouTubers have taken their place. But I would say the market difference would be that a lot of the momentum of BreadTube has been totally astroturfed by legacy media institutions. For example, Vox, the New York Times, sort of doing these glowing reviews of ContraPoints, saying that ContraPoints is de-radicalizing people. And to me, that it just seems that even when the establishment tries to appropriate an organically grown movement such as YouTubers, they still have to astroturf. They still have to do these little games. But even just away from politics, I think YouTube in general has become a corporate cesspool. And the whole original intent of what was the main tagline? As much as I'm not a YouTuber, but I've certainly lived my significant part of my life watching YouTube. Broadcast yourself. That was the motto. That's gone now. That's destroyed. I mean, YouTube has become corporate TV now, and even the political YouTube. I even believe Distributors pointed this out. Political YouTube is a very small subset, but at the same time, the trend in general is towards legacy media colonizing the organic DIY spirit of the internet. I think that's terrible, so.
One thing what do you mean astroturfing? What does astroturfing mean?
Well, basically that they are trying to pretend that it's an organic grassroots grow movement when they're really being an agent of a certain power structure that is sort of signal boosting them. I'm sorry, I'm confused. I don't know the precise definition of astroturfing, but essentially they're sort of the corporate media is using these people to further their agenda by pretending that they are organically grown, when in reality they've been sort of signal boosted by these big monolithic media establishments such as the New York Times.
And we should give ContraPoints their due. I mean, the content they make is excellent. I mean, it's very well produced.
High production,
I would argue that recently that particular YouTuber has essentially, and I hope my microphone's not fading again.
It is. I'm going to be the bearer of bad news. It's still going up and down. Would there be any way for you to contact us through your phone? Loud. I'm going to speak quieter. Would there be any way?
I'm going to move closer here.
Wait. I don't think it's that. I think it has nothing to do with where you're moving. I think it's pretty much just a technical issue with your setup.
Just finish this point.
Okay. Well, I can try to get out and come back in again. I'll just finish this thought.
There, that's good. That's a good spot.
Okay. So I think, well, the issue with ContraPoints is essentially, what's so funny about ContraPoints is that YouTuber ceased being political the second they got boosted by the New York Times and The Economist.
Interesting.
Before that boost from the mainstream, they were very, very political, and they had a lot of opinions, and a lot of them were actually kind of controversial. After they got the boost, there's only one particularly political video I remember them making about incels, and all the other ones were about essentially trans issues. And I think what happened in ContraPoint's case is that they kind of had a foot in each side of the left-wing YouTube community. They had one foot in the mainstream left wing, and they had one foot in the distant communist radical side. And I think that what's going to happen post 2020, especially if Trump loses, and I think that's a growing possibility at this stage, if Trump loses especially, this unified front between radical and mainstream left wing forces on the internet is going to probably completely disintegrate. So that will be my prediction. And I think that will spell a lot of hard times for people like ContraPoints and Lindsay Ellis, who occupy this kind of amphibian role in between the two communities. But that being said, let me log out and try to fix this problem.
Thank you. Another option may be to use your phone. I don't know, just in terms of having a different software to record this stuff, because it seems like a primal issue in the software right now. But anyway, Gio, what do you think about Distributist point?
Wow, that's a white pill, I must say, from my side of the political spectrum. I think I'm skeptical of saying that the intersectionality on the left is going to, like, a lot of normally, like, sort of conservative pundits on Fox News are like, given enough time that they'll break away, and it's like they're going to infight, which is true with every political movement. But I think that perhaps they would maintain a unified front, but if their main motivation for a lot of their steam and energy, which is I would say the aesthetic symbol rather than the man himself of Donald Trump, the aesthetic symbol of their ire, if that were to suddenly disappear as a threat, I would think that even the Democrat Party themselves, they would probably crumble. I mean, as it is, nobody cares about Joe Biden. Nobody likes him. But it's just like, hold your nose, But that's I think Distributus is onto something, because I sort of see, I mean, not to diverge into internet politics here, but I do see the cracks forming. I see the Vaush people, the hardliners. I think they're going to totally cringe themselves, and they're going to explode within a rage, and they're going to call out people like Philosophy Tube and ContraPoint. But this is just, again, this is internet politics. The problem from my perspective, being a person I would associate on the more political right, or I don't even like to use this term, I would call myself rightist in the postmodern sense. I think the problem is that there isn't a unified front, that we exist within a framework of microtribes upon microtribes, upon figures that war with each other periodically. I mean, even on Twitter in our spheres, Lev, I mean, Bronze Age pervert versus Campbot, right? It's always the same thing. But I even think that within the art world, if they didn't have a lot of their funding institutions, a lot of their sort of rallying organizations, I mean, a lot of the art world has become very politicized in that regard. I think that perhaps maybe within the age of a lack of a unified aesthetic movement, or a lack of a unified even political movement, that perhaps decentralization, patchwork, the age of foam, as Sloterdijk calls it, I think that this is an inevitable trend, and even artists that are putting themselves out there are becoming micro movements. I mean, I've made my bones writing about, and betting this would interest you. One of my favorite artists ever is, a collection of artists, Nobody TM, that did these very layered video art projects with their own website and became very popular in the 4chan sphere. And they were doing a lot of video art that is transgressive in the sense of it bringing together things like politics and Neoplatonism and so forth. But the reason Nobody TM became prominent is through internet culture. And I think that that's the way to go. We already are seeing the rise of self-publication. It's inevitable. There are more people who are intelligent and who are motivated to change the culture that are sort of leaving the IQ shredder of academia, the IQ shredder of not even the IQ shredder, I would say the creativity shredder of the art world and academia. And I think that there is sort of subtle white pills here and there that this trend will continue forward. However, I'm naturally more skeptical of this. I mean, I certainly have no illusions being in Canada that I'll be in any art galleries anytime soon. I mean, come on, let's face it. And they're going to put they're going to put
the biggest thing. You need the ambition, though, right? I mean, why? Yeah, I think people that get in those galleries, they want to make it happen, right? They kind of don't care who may or may not hypothetically stand in their way. So I wouldn't just disqualify yourself with, not wanting to try.
Well,
that's
Jules,
true. I mean,
Jules, you're very ambitious. I could tell by the shirt you're wearing. It looks like you fought a Wolverine in order to get here on time.
I was given this by a brand called No Name Saint.
Interesting. I was just about to say, by the way, speaking of Donald Trump to me is kind of like that alien at the end of Watchmen, where the comic version, where it was something that was able to unite a lot of people and give them lifeblood, just generally based on how much they hate this guy. And I'm curious what would happen after he's gone this election, or after he's gone after he gets elected. What is going to be left, as far as, would that be in a way an end of history moment, where now that people have been complaining so long about Donald Trump, what are the things that they're going to grab onto as far as motivation goes.
Well, that's the thing. We have, for the first time, I would think, a postmodern aesthetic object as the president. I mean, we're doomed to live in interesting times, as the Confucians say. But I want to get maybe Ben's perspective on this one. I don't mean to go off, but
I don't know. I guess I have been thinking about will we have a new villain to replace Donald Trump? And leading up to his election, I did not discount the possibility that he could be elected, because again, I was driving through the country and I saw a lot of Hillary's a crook signs and whatnot. I've lived in New York City most of my adult life, but I'm a country boy. I'm from northwestern Pennsylvania, so and I still have family there and still try to get outside of the bubble of New York. But again, I'm in a different bubble. I'm in the Bronx bubble, so it's a very different culture than, say, the Brooklyn, Manhattan culture. My perspective is that I don't understand why the mainstream's so important. Like, when I was young, everything that I was interested in wasn't in the mainstream whatsoever. I mean, the music I was into, the art that I was into, if that's, Gio, what you mean by internet culture, like the stuff that's not in the, most popular channels and whatnot, then I'm all for it. And I think there should be expression of any idea out there. My only concern is that I do think that there's a matter of just like public safety, so like a lot of people are saying, like, they're concerned about the looters and the rioters and whatnot. I guess I would say, like, I'm personally not anti-gun. Again, I'm from the country, and like, guns were just a part of life, but at the same time, like, I don't think anybody should be able to get behind the wheel of a vehicle, like, to me, it's just like, it's not that radical to say, maybe we should have, like, a license. And there are some people who are not wired right, and as a society, I would say there's some, like, lowest common denominator things that the society that I want to live in would have writ as law. But I also acknowledge that I don't share those viewpoints with other people, right? So again, just to the point of the right to life, that's a moral position that I can't deny. That I don't personally agree with it, but like, if someone else has that position, like, I think that's important that they are able to exercise that position. But I wonder if we can contain all these ideas within one country again. We have countries where it's unquestioned to wear a mask, right? So, like, maybe we have regions where it's just like, hey, if you're here, you wear a mask, duh. And then other people don't care. So maybe a state, you don't have to wear a mask. You don't have to worry about shit. Just, like, do whatever you want. Like,
my personal,
that's the only way we're going to get on.
My personal concern, though, with what I think you and Distributist were agreeing on, this kind of like mutual shaking of the hands and splitting away, is that if we're talking about the people, who define culture in an urban setting, let's face it, there are a lot of advantages as well as disadvantages to living in the city. You get to eat all kinds of different food. You get to see all kinds of things that are kind of like the culture of the time. I personally, even though I want to live somewhere out in the countryside just for the sake of health, I value what the city brings. And if we're talking about a splitting up of everybody's, like, living in Alabama or, like, pick any state here, like the flyover states, who is going to be more conservative, and then people who are going to be much more to the left are going to be living in the coastal areas. That to me is a problem, because now the coastal areas aren't going to have any recourse at all for the people who would want to express themselves in a salon type of national arts club, if you will, environment. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, as well as Geo and Distributist and Jules.
People are moving to Texas now.
Yeah, I guess my immediate response would be that at the moment, New York does not seem to be very popular. Mostly people are trying to leave New York. Though I did see something within our sphere. I'm sorry, I can't remember who posted it, but someone in the crypto art realm just tweeted something yesterday or the day before. Like, oh, I'm thinking maybe now's the time to move to New York. So I would say it is the time to move to New York.
Yeah, well, real estate's not exactly going low yet, but we'll see. Isn't that like the whole idea about buying stocks when they're going all the way down, just to catch up on the next wave? So I think there may be something to that. But Distributist, do you see what I'm talking about as far as I don't want there to be this kind of split where the cathedral has control of the cities? And
if establishment progress, I hope my audio is a little bit better now, but if establishment progressives have the cities and Red America has the countryside, all that means is that consensus making institutions and media institutions and university and thought leading institutions will still be under the political purview of the left. The challenge right now for a lot of, I know, obviously it's yet to be seen how much this can be done. The challenge right now for people who are unhappy with the consensus ideology is to create alternative institutions to the university and the media. And I think this is going to involve having control in some large population centers. I don't see how I've never heard of a political division that's essentially partitioned a country in between cities and countryside. It almost always is regional, with mixtures of cities and countrysides in both partition. And I think this is a challenge for people who know that our present order is not sustainable. We're going to have to sort of grow intellectually in a lot of regards to achieve something like this, and not just get the same thing back again.
That's well said. I guess the question is, who's going to decide to, you're going to take this city, I'm going to take this city. It seems like.
Well, I think these things, they might grow organically. I mean, even, I think maybe an example of the art world would be some of my favorite influences come from what they call the Northwest Visionary Schools. That the Northwest Visionary School, painters like Mark Tobey, Morris Graves, they came from like a smaller city, well, outside the outskirts. They all lived in nature, Seattle and the Washington area, and they influenced the larger epicenter of the New York School of painters like Jackson Pollock and so forth. And many people don't even know that. So the reason I bring that example up, I think that Distributist is onto something, in that perhaps people that you can't just like live, as much as this pains me to say this, a million apologies to my Twitter mutuals, you can't just like sort of live this like Linkola, Ted Kaczynski anarcho-primitivist fantasy where you could go into the woods and you could have your QT trad wife and all this. I think inevitably you're going to have to cling to smaller, lower level cities within the quote unquote flyover states, like Kansas, Seal City, you name it, right? Like, I mean, you still need somewhat of an urbanization in order to produce the cultural forms that are occurring now. I mean, of course, it's way easier to be decentralized with technology, but yeah.
I think that the demographic qualities of the right wing and the dissident right in particular have caused us, for people who are interested in sort of the workability of something like this, that they've caused us to ignore sort of the greatest right-wing success story, which in my mind is obviously Israel. Israel is
that's going to be a controversial
thing. But just look at it. Israel is a it's a ultra conservative right wing nationalist state.
Ethno-state almost.
No, it is an ethno state, and that's I'm not necessarily against Israel. It's just
how is it an ethno state?
They have literal genetic tests for incoming immigrants, and they're officially declared a Jewish state.
Well, to be fair, though, we have different kinds of Jews. We have Ashkenazi Jews. We have, what do you call it, the other Jews who were in Spain.
Sephardic.
And then Sephardic, exactly. We have Sephardic Jews. We also have
and there are different types of Europeans as well, right? So, I mean, obviously there are subdivisions, right?
Yeah. Well,
so,
also, one more thing, though. We also have the Druze, and we also have Arabians who live there as well, who also take part in Parliament.
Yeah, but a lot of people say they're like second class almost.
I wouldn't say that. I mean, show me an example of that. I wouldn't necessarily say that.
I'm not saying that it's bad to be necessarily Muslim or Christian in Israel, but the official purpose of the state is, I mean, you could be perfectly well treated as a Christian or a Muslim in Israel, but the official purpose of the state is for one ethnicity, and that ethnicity is not Arab and Muslim. So, and I'm sure there's a lot of diversity inside that ethnicity. There's a lot of diversity inside it. Chinese and European and anything you can say. There's infinite subdivisions. But what Israel has done, and this is quite a magnificent achievement, it's found a way to run a modern technological economy in tandem with a highly religious and highly separatist and highly focused intentional communities. If you want to go join a kibbutz and have a large family and live like the Amish, you can do that. And then your children can come into Tel Aviv and they can live just like they would in New York.
Yeah, with gay parades and everything.
Yeah, exactly. I can't believe that the right wing, I'm not saying that you can't have legitimate grievances against Israel, but sometimes I wonder why the right wing why my side isn't trying to learn more on how to do things, because it gives me hope. Israel shows that you can have a religiously devout, technological society that has replacement birth rates and almost no disruptive immigration, that isn't just supporting the core populations that already exist there, and in the numbers that would sustain that population in majority. All the right-wing objectives are essentially met, and it's not Ted Kaczynski land. It's not going backwards. So I, obviously there are grievances. I'm not going to say there aren't grievances against Israel, but just, you got to hand it to someone when they do something that's really, that works really, really well, right? You could hate Hitler and still say, like, the Panzer tank is awesome, and Israel as a workable system is amazing, and people should be learning from it.
What would you say that the xenofetishism among certain factions of the dissident right, like, why do you think that the Japanese model is something that they highly regard? I don't know if it's just a meme, but it seems the xenofetishism thing is like what a lot of them want.
Oh, they like anime.
Isn't xenofetishism China? Isn't Nippon fetishism?
Sorry, Nippon.
Oh,
sorry,
yeah.
Happonism, yeah. Well, no, but there is xenofetishism now.
There is that too, right? Yeah. Well, I honestly, I don't know. If you were to ask me, having a society that looks at Japan is a nightmare scenario for myself as well. It's an aging population. It has huge problems with pornography and decadence. And there isn't a huge focus on religion, spirituality, transcendence, and back to the land. I don't know. I think, and it feels like it's unsustainable, right? And it seems like a lot of leaders in Japan want to replace people with robots, which I don't like at all. I much more prefer the Israeli model where, intentional communities provide a continuous supply of young people who all see themselves as part of a similar people. And, and that's religious as well, right? The devout and the secular can live together. That is amazing. And I feel that in Japan's case, there are a lot of things to admire about Japanese society. I love obviously Yuko Mishima does not embody contemporary Japanese society, but I'm a huge admirer of Emperor Meiji and that whole transformation. And there's a lot of things to admire about it. But to my mind, Japan has not solved modernity. It's just avoided one particular problem of modernity, and then it's jumped in both feet and all the other problems of modernity.
Yeah, I would add to that. I totally 100% agree. As much as I admire a lot of my aesthetic sensibility comes from Japan, from sumi ink painting, ukiyo printmaking, I'm of course a big fan of Japanese pro wrestling. I think a lot of the problems stem from Japan sort of being capitalism on crack cocaine in a lot of ways, and so this has produced a society of the hikikomori, of the what do they call them, grass eaters? Yeah, where they're a whole nation of shut-ins, men and women too. So their incel problem is, I would say, by magnitudes more advanced. Of course, we're getting there in the West, but their incel problem is sort of by magnitudes greater. Even women are becoming herbivores, grass eaters, where they're shut-ins and they're coders and so forth. So the Israeli model is very, and maybe I don't know much about the art scene in Israel, but I hear some good things about a lot of Iranian artists in particular that are going there. They're finding careers and so forth. So maybe the Israeli model can produce great art as well, that is religiously inspired. So
Israel also demonstrates that you don't have to have mass immigration to essentially interact with global multicultural and cultural exchange, as you just pointed out, right? Like, Iranian artists can be found in Israel. That does not mean that, in 60 years there'll be more Iranians in Israel than there will be Jews, right?
Yeah.
so you can have it both, right? Like, it's not, you don't have to choose, guys, right?
Are there places you see that demographic change happening? Are there places in the world?
Oh yeah, well, it's literally happening in Britain and almost every country in the West. There are massive demographic changes afoot.
So you think in 40 years the populations will be completely different?
Well, in 40 years, definitely in America, that's when whites will become a minority. And I also believe in 50 years, English people will be a minority in Britain, if I'm not mistaken. I could have the dates wrong, but it's something along that time frame.
Why do you think that? Why do you think that?
Because I've seen statistics that have projections that have shown increases along that line. I mean, London is
who will be the majority in America in 40 years? Who do you think will be the majority in America in 40 years?
There might not be a majority.
They might be intermixed between Mestizo and so.
Is that a bad thing? Why isn't that?
It's not like religiously a bad thing. It does present certain problems with organizing a society.
How so?
Well, I mean, we're kind of getting far from the field, but as you see, as we're kind of seeing in our current society, and as have been shown in other studies, having a highly diverse population to where there's no majority or no coherent cultural narrative creates a lot of fracturing and division and lack of social cohesion, as we are experiencing right now in 2020. We don't know who exactly is culturally in charge, in a way that Israel certainly does know who is culturally in charge. And this creates a lot of problems. Now, I think that probably these demographic trends aren't going to change, but we're going to have to come up with different ways of living with them when they happen. And I think from this stream, what I'm hearing is that it seems like the odds on favored are patchwork and separation. I'm not saying there aren't other ways to deal with it, but these are the result of the problem we're talking about.
Well, I think culture.
David, hold on, I have a couple more questions. David, do you think religion is the biggest force of or for culture?
At a long enough time scale, yes. If you were bringing things out to 1,000 years, religion would absolutely be the biggest force. Now, if you go to lower time scales, like decades and hundreds,
cultivation of food would be.
Well, okay, but what do you mean cultivate? Everyone cultivates food, right?
That's Noah Yuval Harari's thesis.
Okay, well, I mean, obviously, if you're a hunter and gatherer society, you're going to be way different from the farming society. I'm not going to, obviously that. I thought that we were talking about two societies that were post-agricultural revolution, and you were trying to predict how they would modify in 1,000 years. I would bet on religion being the biggest impact.
By the way, guys,
so that's what you meant when you said we don't know who's in charge culturally here, but we know who's culturally in charge in Israel. Are you talking about just dominant religion?
I'm talking about dominant. In that case, I'm talking about dominant culture more than dominant religion.
fire behind the culture? What's the force behind the culture? What organizes?
Well, there on a short-term scale, this is one of those things that's easier to see when you stand back, and it's harder to see when you come in close. As you go back to the 1,000-year scale, it's obvious that religion has the biggest impact, I would argue. But when you go into like the decade scale, so many different forces. I would say in Israel's case, what is the biggest cultural influence on that is the fact that it's explicitly a state for ethnic Jewish people, and that the policies are designed to maintain the demographic dominance of that group in that society. As diverse as that group is, and it is a very diverse group, like Europeans are very diverse, right? So that's what I would say is, I would say that that in Israel's case, it's definitely the government. In American society, I think the big problem right now is that the people who create culture in the media and the people who teach culture in the academy have value systems, and they're in possession of what actually is a religion that is massively different from the rest of the population not living, that's not working in the media and the academy and the unelected government.
My last question, David, is, so what do you think of atheists? What's your opinion on atheists or atheist cultures?
Here's a can of worms.
I believe in atheist people, but I don't believe in atheist cultures. Modern progressivism is the greatest example of this. So modern progressives say that they don't believe in anything. They're just all evidence driven. But I think we've seen in 2020 in particular that whatever is going on with modern atheist progressives is indistinguishable from a religion. I just saw a group like if you look in places like Minneapolis now, and if you look in places like Portland, you will see hordes in Seattle, right? You will see hordes of atheistic progressives engaging in ceremonies that could only be described as cathartic religious ceremonies. If you were an alien looking at this phenomenon of BLM in 2020, you could only describe it. You would say like, oh, this is obviously the emergence of a new religion, of a great awakening. So I would say what happens is, when I say religion, what I mean is belief systems that are handed down generationally, and that focus around doctrines that are built into dogmas and teachings that are not really examined in the way we would examine, say, a philosophy. And I hate to be hogging all of this time from your other guests, but as we see now that atheism was only sort of a transitionary phase to a new religion, which is the progressive new religion that we're seeing emerging right before our eyes.
By the way, distributed. The volume still has problems.
That didn't answer my...
Jules, please. The volume still has problems right now. I'm sorry to say it keeps going up and down, and people have been complaining about it in the chat. Would there be...
Well, I'm sorry. I have to get going now in a few minutes. But what did I understand that obviously Zoom is not working with this microphone, and I don't have another one. But I didn't answer your question. Maybe I could just make this my final thing I say.
My follow-up then would be, what do you think about people who don't believe in a life after death, right? So if atheists are behaving religiously, or like they're mimicking religious type behaviors, my question is, what do you think about people who don't believe in life after death or like religiously ordained morality? And that
lots of religions have not believed in life after death. Some forms of Buddhism don't. All forms of Judaism prior to Jesus, or almost all of them, almost all forms of Judaism prior to the time of Jesus did not believe in an afterlife. And some forms of Judaism still, they don't explicitly deny it, but they do not hold it up as a necessary thing. So I think religions that don't have afterlives are actually and so I think that, but I don't think that makes them operate differently, is what I would say, right? I think that if you're an alien and you were looking at these things just from a sociological point of view, they work very, very similarly
in terms of organization. But what about in terms of how they prioritize, like what people who believe, what Steven Pinker was saying that Nassim says he was debunking, Steven Pinker said that he thought belief in an afterlife made people less productive to solving specific problems.
Okay, I mean, let's take a look at this, right? Let's look at the world at 1000 AD. You could color the map in between religions that have a strong belief in an afterlife and religions that didn't. All of the scientific discoveries from one areas of the map that where religion, they all came out of religions that had a strong belief in the afterlife. To say that religions that have a strong belief in the afterlife make people less efficient or less focused on science, I don't know how you would explain why the scientific revolution came out of the continent that had a religion that put the most focus on the afterlife of all religions. I don't know how you explain it under Steven Pinker's thesis. I'd have to see a lot of evidence of that before I would even begin to entertain something like that in the light of the history that I see. And Steven Pinker he just asserts it. I didn't see anything that backed that up.
I know the diversity. I think Steven Pinker likes to bend things.
Yeah, I just want to say for the audience, I know the diversity causes social discohesion. I know that's controversial. There are like 1,000 papers on each side of the controversy, but at least there are 1,000 papers on the pro side of that controversy. And I think if you look at them in combination with an understanding of statistics, you see that the central thesis of diversity hurting social cohesion still shines through. But with Steven Pinker's statement, I don't even see the beginning of an evidential basis for that statement, and that's sort of where I'm kind of losing him, I guess.
Well, before you go, can I ask you something, Distributus?
Sure. I apologize again for the microphone. It just the Zoom. I don't know what's happened. This doesn't work with this computer for some reason.
I think for some reason some program may be taking like full control of your audio, and it's like trying to balance it out according to what it thinks.
Maybe it's the glow-in-the-dark organizations they're onto us. So
yeah.
We talked before. You talked with my friend who's also an artist, and we were talking about the future of art, how you cannot cut through post-modernity. I mean, sorry, you have to cut through. You can't just eliminate a lot of postmodern trends. But you had a tweet the other day, and me dabbling in abstract expressionism, you said that in terms of aesthetics, that realism would have to be the way of the future for any sort of dissident aesthetic. Now, can you maybe elaborate on that for me? I kind of agree, but yeah.
Okay, I mean, let's take a step back here. Twitter, sometimes I think Twitter is the scourge of humanity because almost every insult is under 144 characters, and almost no insight is, or no nuanced insight is, right? So I think a lot of people heard a half truth from that. I consider right-wing political theory to be realist. And I consider right-wing artistic temperaments to be realist.
That's true.
And I'm not saying I love abstract art. I much prefer a Monet to like a photorealistic piece from like Thomas Cole or something, right?
Yeah.
Although I do, Thomas Cole's not bad. I'm not saying he's bad, right? But I think, abstraction, and I'm actually quite fond of abstract art as well. The problem is that I think what happens with humans generally is that we're very addicted to things that aren't realist, right? Once we can go off in our own fantasy land to just depart from human experience, we will do that, right? We will naturally kind of degrade away from that. So I think the role of the right wing politically, as well as the role of the right wing artistically, it's not to drown out everything in realism necessarily. There still is a role for political idealism, just as there is a role for abstract art. But it's to make sure that the abstract and the ideological doesn't run away with the entire system. Mm-hmm. Art has to have its feet on the ground. It can't be total. And if you look at modern art, and I like a lot of it, I'm not saying I don't like it, but a lot of it is just totally detached from any experience any person would actually have in the world that we currently occupy. And I don't think that art as such doing that is doing its job.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. As much as I love the intellectual curiosities of contemporary art, I think that what you're describing would probably be the Impressionists, the plein air painters. They're probably the bridge between both worlds. Even certain abstract expressionists like Milton Resnick, who retained a lot of representation. You are right. There's something that compels us towards representation that speaks to our souls in a lot of ways. So
yeah, I mean, humans are spirit and body, and it has to be both, right? And I just think that there is this Gnostic temptation always in humanity to try to get rid of our bodies and that which grounds us. And I just, I'm not a huge hip hop fan, but one thing the expression I love about hip hop, they always say things are real, right?
Yeah,
I love that about hip hop. I love how like hip hop, and again, like I'm not the biggest fan, but the thing I like about it is that it constantly like drags you down to earth, right? Like it constantly wants you to be here, like be with me, be in this message I'm giving you, right? Like don't be off in like this progressive rock where you're just listening to the music of the spheres. Like, let's look at what's actually going down right now. And I think just sometimes like that, and in many ways that, to my mind, is the role of the right wing in politics and the role of realism in art. And I was just trying to express the analogy of that.
So we can't like be like Nick Land and go off and listen to jungle music and yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting.
I apologize so much for my mic, guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much,
Thank you, David. It was so great to meet you.
I apologize that Zoom just doesn't work on the computer for some reason.
I would love for you to come back in the future after this audio issue is fixed. You're an amazing guest.
Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate. Thank you, everyone. I learned a lot. I want to take another look. Brenton, you made me want to take another look at the BLM movement's effect on art and try to be more optimistic about it this time. But have a good night, guys.
Have a good night. And everybody who's watching this, don't forget to subscribe. We got to grow right now, and we really appreciate the distributors coming on. I would love to have them back on when the audio situation is fixed, all fixed up. And I really appreciate everybody sticking around for this. We have a couple of questions in the chat section from John Gonzalez. Let's see. So John Gonzalez was talking earlier about art, and he was asking a question about art, but I can't seem to find it right now. Well, I guess he wanted us to also go back to speaking about art. Let's see.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we did kind of. Well, somebody else had a question about memes and art. So, Gio, you're kind of a meme expert here. Would you say that meme art, and I've seen a lot of it in crypto art as well, Benton, you're definitely aware of Pepe the Frog being used in a lot of crypto art lately. And I'm curious... Dogecoin, exactly. So, Gio, I'm curious what you think is going to happen with memes as art as we keep going forward.
This is a topic I've often dealt with for many years now. Some of my first articles I've ever written that I've put online have been to do with memes. One of the articles I wrote for West Coast Reactionaries was called Synchronous Arisings, about the Pepe the Frog meme. I think it was after the Jordan Peterson talk on like Pepe. It was just like surreal. I think that my problem, some of the sort of the curse and the blessing of meme culture is that it is very ephemeral. It is very much a, what would you say, a Deleuzian, a deterritorialized entity that sort of crosses and goes across the strata and collects different brokerages of different meanings. I had a thread the other day about why the wall of text meme, like, this thing like, oh, the left can't meme because they have like this wall of text where they have to explain everything. I think that's, in some ways that's true, because the glory, but also the detriment of meme culture is that it is very much a pictorial language that is ever changing and evolving and then vanishing and going into a sort of artwork unto death. Like, Heidegger talks about how the artwork dies because it's detached from its cultural roots. Well, memes die all the time, but memes are also resurrected. So I think that the problem with meme culture is that I'm skeptical of grounding an artistic, sort of like an aesthetic movement that is decentralized out of it. I think there's certainly a capacity for it, but I think the problem with meme culture is that there's too much reliance on like shock value, on the ephemeralness of it. Like, you can't, like, memes are everywhere. Memes are like viruses. Again, I don't like to use I want to get away from the language of like NRX and Nick Land and all that, but it is true. Memes are like a language that's like a virus that self-replicates, that mutates and changes and so forth. But at the same time, I think that because memes as of yet have an effect in the hyperreal world in the internet, but they're just starting to affect real, quote unquote, IRL meat space change. You could say that Pepe is one of them, but I would say that the problem is that the steam and the momentum generated by meme culture around, for example, Donald Trump, that is sort of like very ephemeral, and that sort of like peters out after a while, and then realpolitik comes and fills the void. But memes, of course, are potential, but whether or not they are an art form, I think the same way as much as I love cinema, for example, I think that the problem is that they lack an aura, to quote Walter Benjamin. They don't have the sort of like originality to them, because that's sort of like the way of meme culture itself. You have to be anonymous. Like, who knows who creates this edit of like Doge saying, Karen, how could you, or whatever. Like, you don't know, right? Some anonymous guy on 4chan. So by definition, it is an auraless art, the way that film is, unless you have like some very specific auteur filmmaker, like a Fassbender or a Stanley Kubrick. Not even Stanley Kubrick was even that, because he still had to have a whole crew with him. Like, so this is what I mean by an aura. It lacks that sort of originality to place that meme upon a certain artist, because even the guy that created Pepe the Frog, did he really create Pepe the Frog? I mean, he may have created the template, but he like totally disavowed it, the way like Robert Crumb disavowed Fritz the Cat, just like he killed Pepe. But Pepe, you can't kill Pepe, because you can't. The only way you can kill a meme is if it becomes totally overused, becomes totally forced, and it sort of has to go to its own life cycle. But
or you could be Winnie the Pooh in China, right?
Yeah, but even that meme is sort of stale. Like, we had the live stream of the Green Line. Who cares about the Green Line anymore? You know what I mean? Yeah. Like,
it still sometimes works with like Corona Chan having a little Winnie the Pooh doll. You know, that's kind of cute.
Well, yeah, exactly. Corona Chan. I mean, the Corona Chan thing, I think, would be a template of like a lot of other Chans, like Ebola Chan. Like,
wait, Benton, are you familiar with Corona Chan?
No, but I think I have to look it up.
So,
yeah, Lev, you should
so the idea behind anything with a Chan at the end, it's like the idea of like a
4chan, 8chan.
Yes, but it's also a Japanese term for like, you know, somebody who's like
Chan means dear. It's like a, you know, like an elder would say it to
exactly.
Yeah,
and it's sometimes used for like, you know, like cute girls, like cute, you know, like idols who go on stage in Japan, as well as certain characters that people look up to, that they would have like dolls of. So the idea behind all these different Chans of diseases, like Ebola Chan, Corona Chan, is you would create these anime girls out of things that people would be naturally repelled by, and like inverse this idea of making something so horrible and so deadly just look so cute.
Well, that has a grounding in Japanese culture, because, as you know, I don't know if it's a stereotype or not, but in Japanese culture, you always want to try to touch in some ways or effectuate the thing that you're most terrified of. For example, a lot of back in the day with like OG Japanese wrestling that was inspired by America, a lot of these very like big muscular gaijin wrestlers that came from like Texas, like Stan Hansen, or like the original Sheik. They were terrified of him, to the point where the original Sheik would have to go through a sea of people where they're trying to touch him all at once. And then his nephew Sabu was like all uptight, and he was like, you know, swinging the knife around and swinging the chair around, and all these people trying to touch him, because I think Ebola Chan and
Ebola Chan. We should meme Ebola Chan into reality.
Yeah, well, there you go.
My
fashy waifu. Yeah, no, but I think this is an extension, I think, of that Japanese the sort of Shintoist predisposition to confront the thing that you are most afraid of by physically touching it. You know, and you have these very long, like, 4chan threads where, you know, Corona-chan possesses me and all this stuff, and yeah.
Well, it's also related to
I can't
play
believe we're
gods.
Like trying to intellectualize Corona-chan. I can't believe it.
But it's related to play gods as well. Like, you would have Nergal, who was worshipped in the Middle East, and I don't know if these two things...
is that where the Behemoth singer got his name from, Nergal?
Maybe. Well, Nergal was one of the chief Babylonian deities, and he was the deity of like plagues, poisons, things like that. And he was also carrying a staff with what I think is like the 7 chakras on it. So all these things are very old, and I think they intersect, and I think like they're branches of a single tree, as it were, with all this mythology we're talking about.
Magic is exactly like the ancient chaos god, right?
Well, that's the whole thing with Peppy the Frog. Benton, if you don't know, the idea there is that people would post on 4chan have a certain number that every one of their posts gets, and it's like a really long number. And if they get a number with a certain amount of digits, like trips, quads,
trips,
like,
getting trips,
yes, exactly. Quad would be like 4444, or 55555. That to them would be like a way of fortune telling, where whatever post was written would have to correspond with something that would occur later on. So it's kind of like an I Ching sort of thing, It's kind of like a modern take on a lot of these fortune telling systems, which use the process of randomness to create certain outcomes in this world, as in the idea of us being able to, in a certain way, control reality itself through this process.
That reminds me of Gerhard Richter's glass stained windows. Do you know about this?
No.
Ben, do you know about this?
No, I don't know those works of his.
Yeah, well, basically, Gerhard Richter, he was commissioned to do a stained glass window, and I forget which cathedral in was it Switzerland or England, where basically he used a random number generator from a computer program to place different quadrants of stained glass panels. And so, in a way, it mimics that of an original stained glass, but it's mediated through an impersonal digital technology that places random squares within sequences of each panel. So it's totally non-representational, but that was sort of his ability to bridge the gap between an incredibly traditional medium like stained glass and like random, like, accelerationist number generation. So I think that's a very interesting, I might write about something about that, but that's like, to me, it's an example of almost like the 4chaners pretending to like get the trips and the dubs and the number sequences. It's like the I Ching, right? Like Carl Jung was very fascinated with the I Ching, for example.
I'm also fascinated by it. It's a very interesting system. And I found the question of John Gonzalez, which is, guys, what are your takes on art at this moment, or on how it is getting affected by polarization and current pop cultures? So we touched on memes. Now I would like to touch on pop culture.
I'm a pop-timist. So
optimism and poptimism here.
I think that I think a lot of the stuff that can be seen as termite art. So we were talking about accelerationism. We interviewed an actress from a film. It was like a mockumentary on an energy sports drink advertisement called Drib. And in the beginning of the film, one of the main characters is talking about accelerationism. And this was after an intro to the film spoke about termite and elephant art. And elephant art was seen as art that tries to preserve something. And termite art was seen as art that tries to kind of break away or chip away at something. And I think that art throughout history has always been a balance between these two dynamics. And you could even point to a lot of art as simultaneously, like in a yin yang fashion, tries to do a balance of both of those things. And I think pop culture, if right now we see a lot more termite behavior, maybe from a conservative perspective, they would see like the breakdown of the family values and the deteriorating marriage rates and low birth rates. They might trace to kind of a breakdown in pop culture. But I also think it's that kind of disruption that does inspire constructive behavior and discussions, and even like the pendulum swings to conservative style art to properly contend, because I think it's in human nature to love stability and to love your neighbors. And I think when people feel like they're in a Kafkaesque environment and like being chronically alone and isolated. And and at times, like in cancel culture, like being guilty of a crime, you have no idea of what it is. I think people are, I think these are forces that inspire culture in general to elevate.
Well, right now it seems to be inspiring a lot of, let's say, Paul Joseph Watsons out there to always talk about, you know what I mean? Like to be the mainstream media and talk about how all of these things suck. But as far as actual stuff coming out of the quote unquote, right? Like my favorite take on this was Mencius Moldbugs on the interview he did with Michael Malice, where he says that this idea of a right, all that really means is everything that is outside of this cathedral mainstream thing. Which is why, like, personally, I don't consider myself to be on the right. I don't consider myself to be on the left either. I could take a lot of different things from all these different factors, which is why I prefer living both in the city and the country, because I see the benefit of both. But I think that kind of Phoenix-style regeneration of culture, like having a renaissance, would have to be way more than just saying all these things suck, I hate all these things, let's return to the tradition. Or just
shitposting, yeah.
Exactly. Even though I love shitposting, it's got its place, definitely. I feel like something is lacking as far as art that talks more about transcendence. And personally, this is why I had a bit of a hazy feeling when I was walking around New York City last year during Pride Month, where, like, that's great, we have Pride Month, but the thing is that if the only focus is this is our identity and this is how wonderful it is, it almost feels like if there's nothing else to talk about, if that's just a celebration of whatever identity, whether it's gay, whether it's whatever, to me it feels like if that's where we're at, it's not going to be enough to create a renaissance. And the true renaissance, I think, would have to dig deeper into the subconscious and extract certain things out of it that's going to make people go, wow, holy shit, I had no idea that this is something that we as the human race are capable of. So I'm curious, if there are any thoughts on that, the renaissance of art.
It's too easy to hate on conceptual art, you find. Like, I think if you look at some of the stuff you put in galleries, like so much of modern art, I forgot who said this. It might have been from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. But a lot of modern art is, I could have done that, or I could have thought of that, but I didn't, right? And when you look at, I visited someone's gallery. He had 7 artists working there. He never touched canvas. He never touched a sculpture. Maybe he did originally. And he was showing off paintings that he was selling for $700,000, and he comes to me, and I think he was absolutely serious. He was like, "Do you want to see the greatest painting I ever made?" I said, "Yeah, of course." And he shows me a small picture of a circle. It's just like a circle, like a pencil circle. And I, at this moment, I was just like, I can't believe this is like an echelon of the art world. It was a very weird. This was like at the youth of my college career, and I was getting a sort of a back end view in what we were talking about in this stream, and it's easy to be like, what the hell is all that about? Is that just some Wizard of Oz just nonsense? Is it an Emperor Has No Clothes nonsense? Is it just a big bubble? It's just a big worthless bubble. And I think it's very easy you look at Dadaism, like, oh yeah, let's put a urinal in a museum, and and this is found art. And I think one of the reasons why we've seen so much of this conceptual art, it's been an outgrowth from postmodernism. Like, it's the philosophical challenges of postmodernism, like, have manifested themselves in the art world, as in a lot of art is supposed to kind of like break down how you think and feel according to postmodernism. It's not supposed to demonstrate craftsmanship as much as it is to like fuck with your mind, right? Like a lot of postmodern art is just a big mind fuck. And then you have to kind of do these mental contortions to kind of think about what's the significance here. The only reason Mondrian is in a museum is because of how he was able to write and explain the significance of his simple composition.
By the way, Benton has to go, so I just wanted Benton for you to have the last word here, and just let us know what you thought.
Just my last word.
Your last word, yes.
The last word. Well, I just maybe like to touch upon a couple of things that came up. Back to the divvying up of the land. I actually think that there are plenty of cities throughout America, and I don't know that we need to have huge cities. The reality is that, I travel a decent amount, and I'm always surprised at finding all kinds of unexpected things wherever I go. And an example would be finding restaurants of great ethnic variety all across the continent of the United States, the North American continent, at least the American part, Gio. And so I don't know that this divvying up. First of all, I'm not even necessarily advocating it. My point of view is I'm not sure like why it's so important for one culture or another to win. Like, I always just had an attitude that like I probably feel differently than almost everybody, and like I kind of feel alienated from most attitudes that I come across. I have just a few beliefs that I have, of course. So I'm not sure why the goal is to win and dominate, because as long as we can do our own things, it's all good. So that's why, to the point of like banks and whatnot, I don't use a bank, I use a credit union. I believe in sort of self-organizing on a smaller level. But that's because I come from the countryside. I'm not.
Well, you're a nice guy. You're a good person.
Not a city rat. Not a city rat.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm definitely in my adult life. I've been in the city, almost all my adult life. But as far as the other point that I want to make about that is that the thing is that we're all older. The reality is that young people are creating an entirely different world for themselves. I mean, young people largely live networked with each other. This whole thing that happened with the Trump rally, with all the fake tickets being, you guys know.
Yeah,
about
the K-pop stands.
Yeah,
it was kids. It was just a bunch of kids who were like always on with each other, gaming in Fortnite or whatever, and they're like, "Oh, this would be funny," So like, I don't know. It's, to me, all these concerns just seem so old-fashioned.
Well, even in that sphere, though, and I don't want to interrupt too much, but I just want to get a quick thing in here before you go, is that even in these spheres, I still look at it in a way kind of like foreign policy, where as much as we want to be good people, there's always going to be a power gap. So if we're talking about cultures, there's always going to be another culture that sees that this culture is weakening, and they're going to try to, I wish they didn't, I wish they'd be like you. They'd want to try to get...
Yes, Mom, I'm coming. I really have to go.
Yeah. So that's just the only thing that I want to add.
Family values, I have to like go have dinner with my mother.
Your mom's wonderful, by the way. I got to meet her yesterday online. She is lovely.
Well, thanks. She enjoyed talking with you as well. I've been meeting you. So anyway, I don't know. I guess that's my thought is like, live and let live. I mean, man, like I suspect that we can all, if we put the brakes a little bit on those few parts of human society that feel like they need everything for themselves, the greediest, right? Then we can probably all have a little space for ourselves. Unfortunately, the really greedy are getting more audacious all the time. It's just my 2 cents.
I could definitely see that. And
by the way, before you go, I just want to ask you because I saw in your bio that you worked with Dream Theater. I'm a huge Dream Theater fan. So,
oh yeah,
what did you do for them?
I was their video director for a few tours.
Oh wow!
I may have
seen one of those tours where you were directing, especially where Jordan does all the visuals with the keyboard. So
yeah, he was doing on both tours. He was doing controlling visuals in different ways. So
oh wow!
All right, I'm sorry,
Benton. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate
you.
you taking the time to do this.
Everybody watching, and take care, guys.
Take care.
Nice to meet you, Benton. Take care.
Take care.
See ya.
Bye-bye. So I think this would be a good time for us to just say our last words and then call the stream a day. But I really want to thank everybody for watching this. Please subscribe. Gio, well, let's start. Jules, so let's start with you and then let's go to Gio.
Well, I just spoke before Benton. I had a great time. I like the short stream too. The art world, I don't think it's as siloed as it used to be. And I think that's other big part of my poptimism. And so I know a lot of the guests and potentially a lot of our audience is very cynical and has a lot of complaints about the art world and the way it's affecting people and behavior. But while I don't share their cynicism there, I do see a need for strong culture. And culture has been a focus of mine on social media since I started. Impact culture has been my hashtag on Twitter, maybe since I started it. So that would be over 10 years of thinking about the significance of culture, at least, and while I was at college, and thinking about just the imbalance of left-wing, more authoritarian forces. The only way you can have a culture that can compete with a culture that desires authoritarianism is you need sovereign individuals. And I think that comes in a lot of shapes and sizes. But instead of focusing as much about the specific qualities sovereign individuals need to have, I think it's more efficient to focus on the contagion of that desire and let other people kind of figure out how they manifest that in themselves. Because if you start focusing too much on right and wrong behaviors, you make it very hard to amplify and build people up. But if you trust in their self-interest and you make certain desire drives fashionable, I think that's how you really hijack decentralization in a way that becomes strong enough to compete with centralization.
That's well said. And Gio, before we get to you, I wanted to highlight a tweet screenshot where Kitastic of Ash and Elm wrote "finished Mishima," and then Isidore wrote, "Did he like it?"
Oh, I screencast that. Oh, boy.
That was nice because we were speaking of Mishima earlier. But and also before I get to you, I wanted to say one final comments here from the chat. So somebody asked, Info Warlock asked, anyone seen the Fortnite visual concerts? This is a glimpse of the new art. And then he said architecture has also been subordinated to technology and therefore represents its values like the ephemeralization over the enduring nature. And we got a comment from John Gonzalez. It was pretty cool, guys. I personally think art will always be with us and culture will always be growing and being beautiful to make our lives beautiful. Well said.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, John.
Oh, and also one more
chat too.
One more from Dawit Haberstman. Okay, I'm gonna have to try that again. But he said, "Funny how pre-modern architecture is so much more durable and aesthetic than postmodern jerks." We're gonna have an architecture stream coming up, and in fact, I want to announce to everybody here that we are going to have this Tuesday a stream about the statues being torn down and what the symbolic significance of that is and what comes after. And we're going to be joined by the one and only Sunny. We're going to be joined by Graventus. We're going to be joined by a couple of interesting people. Let's see.
I'll be there. Don't worry about it.
Please. Head butters in there.
Please come in there. And we're also going to be joined by Verse Laloon and Andrew Meyer.
Oh no!
And
now
guess who
I
else?
have to-
And guess who else? Gennadi's coming.
Oh
Yes.
god! Oh boy!
Yes.
Yes! It's gonna be a bloodbath. It's gonna be CZW tournament of death.
It's gonna be great.
Bring the light tubes.
So I'm looking forward to that. And Gio, end the show.
Yeah. I'm glad that we've outed Jules as a delusion because he's talking about energetic forces of desire that are productive, decoupling the stratified centralization through various channels and flows of intensities. But yeah, what was I gonna say? I think that at the end of the day, we are all going to become internet grifters, and I certainly, now that I've reached 5K follows,
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. I hopefully will open up a Patreon, and I will be a whore, and I will I'm gonna do the little dance. No, I mean, I feel that like it's good to get rewarded for your work. I do have people that commission me for stuff, and by the way, I'm always happy to open up DMs for commissions. Don't worry about it. I will do whatever. If you like my style, you like my stuff, please don't feel free. My rates are kind of cheap. I say kind of, but it depends where you live because shipping and all that stuff. But yeah, I think that this conversation was very good. I wish that we would have gotten into Benton's particular art style of digital art. I think that's a growing thing. As much as I'm resistant to it, I don't believe in any sort of digital crutch, but I do have a lot of friends who are digital artists who do very good stuff. But me, myself, I am more a traditional crafts person. I do like printing and traditional painting and things like that. But yeah, to end, I would say that there are some white pills. There are some clear pills. My biggest problem as things are now is that we are very much in a mono vocal mode within the art world. The BLM thing, the race issues have been sort of like pretty much an enforced constant for the last, I would say, few decades. A lot of that art is bad, but a lot of that art is good. I do admire artists like Kara Walker, for instance. I know a lot of like I know Jared Taylor at American Renaissance had a video on her where he was incredibly critical. But I do think that a lot of the art is necessary, even just as a negative example, because even the artists that I critique in my paper on the Abortion is Normal exhibit, I do give them a lot of reverence. I do think their art is very important. People like Cindy Sherman and Laurie Simmons, who happens to be Lena Dunham's mother, and Carol Dunham, who happens to be Lena Dunham's father.
I was just about to say about the dad with the butthole paintings.
Yeah, well, I critique the butthole paintings. So if you go to Rocker Review, go to my blog, it's linked there. You will see me critique Carol Dunham's gangrenous, gaping vagina and butthole paintings. I give a very academic analysis of them. And so I think that they are indicative of a certain sort of like politicized neo-secular spirituality. I think that it's the return of the great mother. Even Bronze Age Pervert was talking about that recently, about the return of the terrible mother that consumes their children. That's the essence of my thesis, not to give as much away. It is a 70-pager. It's in 3 parts, and hopefully the 3rd part will come out soon. I just have to get Seneca Reeds on that. He's the head editor of Rocker Reviews. So so enough shilling. I think that if we continue to engage with this type of good content, then hopefully the cream will rise to the top. And it's going to be, I think if Trump loses, I don't know what's going to happen in terms of art and culture. I think that maybe, I personally believe that maybe we would have been in a better position if Hillary won at this point, because they wouldn't have been so ravenous to cancel people. But that's just my
there was
take.
also a point that I remember someone was making about how certain plans that Trump wanted to enact as far as the wall, that was already something that but that was also something that the Obama administration wanted to do. So the question,
yeah, they in fact the Obama administration did vigorously enforce immigration, even more deportees than Trump's first 4 years.
So the question there is, like, if you're going to be like a loud hammer and just hammer on these things, sure, you're going to have like this big base of people around you, but wouldn't certain things be better done in a much more, let's say, elegant, velvety way.
Exactly,
you know what I mean?
exactly. And Moldbug agrees. I think that I said this to my old man the other day. It's funny you bring this up. I said, if Trump truly hated his enemies, if he truly wanted to dick over the people that hated him, he wouldn't say anything. He wouldn't go on like these Twitter tirades about, Ocasio-Cortez, she's a loser. Who cares about her? It's like, if you wanted to screw over Ocasio-Cortez, you better start doing the gerrymandering. You better start passing those laws. You better start doing executive orders. You can't just go out there and tweet what you're going to do. I mean, this is what I mean by Trump as a postmodern aesthetic presidency, because he is an aesthetic object of the scapegoat. If you read Rene Girard, I believe that he is a force of mimetic value that is really a total postmodern Baudrillardian simulation, and that what he's actually doing compared to the image of Trump, and by the way, this is reflected in the art world. A lot of art commissions, a lot of very high-priced art is being done of this one gallery I saw where Trump has a pussy on his face that's being a painting, or some artist did period blood painting of Donald Trump. And
once he goes away, a whole industry is going to crumble. They're
going to crumble. The anti-Trump, the resist Twitter people that commission this art, the rich people in New York, what are they going to do when Trump is gone? Maybe who knows if Trump is a stepping stone to an actual fascist? I mean, then who knows what's going to happen? But of course, an actual fascist, they wouldn't know who he is. He wouldn't be as vocal in public as Trump is, because Trump truly is the media celebrity president. He is the WWE kayfabe heel president. So he learned from the best. He learned from Vince McMahon, his friend. So that's my opinion.
The future of America really, I think, does depend on
professional wrestling.
Professional wrestling. Yeah, maybe 16 years, maybe 16 years, 20 years. I think people don't even know how vulnerable we are to centralizing forces abroad, and how quickly everything could flip one way or another. So I agree.
By the way, Dawit, and I'm going to say your name correctly this time, Dawit Habtemariam asks, how's that all art in relation to Trump and all that? Well, I guess you did say that he is a postmodern president, but...
Well, he is the performance. He is going to complete the system of Hegelian dialectics within the aesthetic object by making himself a work of art. So I think Campbell is sort of kind of right, but kind of wrong. I think Trump himself is the completion within the aesthetic object of the German idealist system. So, but a more serious point would be that what I mean is that the persona of Trump, if we're talking about the Jungian concept, the persona of his public image, the image of the Trump face itself, is the performance art, is the aesthetic option. His tweeting is, in a way, I would say, like this bombastic reality show television, Simona Verita, now we don't have a real president, we have a life of a fictionalized caricature president within the White House. And I think that it's a reflection of American culture and society. And so basically I've summed up 4 years of think pieces in the Atlantic in just basically 5 minutes of ranting. So
and to correct what I said, DeWeed understood what you meant by Trump. His question about how's all that art has to do with the period shit, as he says.
Well, basically a lot of contemporary artists, even artists that have used representation, a lot of it is very firmly grounded within the corporeal and within the bodily. For the art that I'm critiquing in the Abortion is Normal gallery, the article itself is the three-part is called Bodily Profanations, meaning that the body itself has become the site of a political war, of a political conflict. So it makes perfect sense for a feminist artist to draw Trump in period blood, because that in a way is almost like through the body. It's a materialist metaphysics of the body, in that your bodily excretions become that subduing of the image, imago symbol of Trump. And that's like a very, very intellectualized way to critique of fucking edgy, period blood artwork. But this is the problem, I think, with the right, is that we don't want to engage in this. We just want to be like Paul Joseph Watson. That's all terrible. Let's not punk rock. That's
and
I don't believe that's the way.
They don't want to play ball. They don't want to play ball.
You got to play ball. Exactly. I think that there was beginning of 2016, there was an approach to that within, again, I hate to bring it up again, the LD50 gallery. I think that there was promise, but of course it got canceled and a lot of those people left, like Menaquan 4 left and all that stuff. But I think that the problem with a lot of maybe not even the right, but maybe the normie conservatives, a lot of their problem is that they get their aesthetic sensibility from fucking Norman Rockwell. So they don't really engage, not to like totally bash Norman Rockwell, but I'm saying that they have a very flowery view of aesthetics compared to where the contemporary culture is going and where it's at. I think you have to, as much as you hate Carol Dunham's butthole paintings, Carol Dunham's paintings of women that are very depersonalized, they are just their vaginal organs. That's there for a very specific reason. And you have to really engage within a critique of that as much as you think it's crass and degenerate. Well, it is crass and degenerate. I mean, I have my moral standards, but I think that you have to really examine these things in order to be a productive, how shall I say this? In order to really hit them where it hurts, you have to learn where their mindset is, because as it is said in, The Art of War, a cliche, like, to know your enemy like you know yourself. And I think a big problem is, to quote Proverbs, the prudent man gathereth wisdom, but the wise man seeketh wisdom. And what I mean by that is that we are just gathering information, but you have to actually go out and seek these things in order to truly be wise. So
that is learn from experience. What was I going to say? Gulliver's Travels was a very body book. It's vulgar, right? Mm. And I think in that spirit, we've been very conscious to make a body show. Like, this is not a show for kids. Like, we're vulgar frequently, and it's but it's different from a vagina painting, and I think dissident, impactful commentary, sometimes the best packaging is crass.
Yeah, but here's the thing about the vagina paintings. I mean, the thing that they're trying to do, a lot of them, they're just trying to LARP Georgia O'Keeffe. I'm a huge fan of Georgia O'Keeffe because I think what she was doing with her vaginal landscapes, her vaginal flowers, is that she was trying to situate the feminine within the natural world and within ultimately a spirituality that grounded her to where she was living in New Mexico. But I think nowadays the vaginal in art, it's become a cliched term. It's become like a critical theory art school thing. I think that a lot of it is grotesque and crass in the sense of it has no higher purpose but the bodily. That's my biggest critique of it. I think that, a lot of artists that are depicting, like a lot of eco-feminists, they have very like nudity in art. And for example, even contemporary artists like Jenny Saville, her stuff is very illuminating because there is an element of spirituality there. But a lot of these artists, they're doing it just, again, it's like Marilyn Manson shock value. You know what I mean? They think it's like a very intellectual critique, but a lot of it is like, oh, well, Donald Trump has a pussy on his mouth. It's like, the voice of Trump, the voice of the masculine patriarchy. Now that's subverted with
it's their version.
My ex hooked up with Marilyn Manson, and she told me, how he was explaining how he chose his name because it was a combination of Marilyn Monroe and Charles Manson.
They're like, the A-side, B-side celebrity of America. Yeah.
So his shock art, I think Marilyn Manson is a great artist. I don't think he's like there's a difference between Tom Green shock art and like Marilyn Manson shock art.
Well, he's a smart cookie. He's like a Mensa member and all that.
I think laughing at Tom Green might make you stupider, right? Like, I think there's actual comedy where if you fall into the trap of laughing at the comedy, it's actually dumbing you down. Like, it's actually wiring your brain.
I know what you put,
and it's actually making you stupid.
Would you put Tim and Eric? Tim and Eric?
I wouldn't, but I think it makes you attracted to grotesque things. I think that's what Tim and Eric.
I'm a big Tim and Eric fan.
Who's that one that got canceled recently? He was a pederast or?
Which one?
the comedian
Chris D'Elia.
Chris D'Elia. Yeah. What was it? Was he wasn't he that type of comedy of like very like Joe Rogan bro-ish? Like
I think so. Well, he was a comic who was really popular with I think like Justin Bieber and a lot of different celebrities. Like he was in that circle.
oh, okay. So yeah, then it explains it.
Yeah.
Oh,
I know. I did
boy.
like that scene with Tom Green in Freddy Got Fingered, where he was spinning around the baby to wake it up, and then we had these Mexican ladies on their musical
Oh, God.
instruments. It was a very interesting
early
combination.
2000s. The early 2000s.
Yeah. No, but
Oh,
some of
boy.
the stuff was too dumb, even for me.
Oh, God.
Even for me. Even though I loved Tim and Eric so much, I would just go on YouTube right before I fall asleep and just watch some of their scenes, like the Terry Green Machine, where Eric has his hands like bloodied over here, like he has these giant scars, and he goes to Tim's house to get tissue paper, and he says, "Help yourself." Meanwhile, Tim is preparing caramel popcorn, not even helping his friend out. He just says, "Help yourself." So while Eric is bandaging himself, we hear like these gross sounds of the caramel popcorn being created,
Oh, God.
and Eric go like, oh, just like trying to bandage his hands. So stuff like that, I know it's kind of gross and dumb, but the way that it's done is very nuanced, and that's what I love about Tim and Eric.
That almost reminds me of Sad World. Do you know Sad World?
No, I know Cool
From
World.
Daria?
Yeah, Sad World. They're an internet. They're like, it's like a father and son. And if you were to take like Sam Hyde, but like less edgy, less political, and smash them with like hyper editing, like that World $1 Million Extreme, and like Tim and Eric, you'd get like Sad World. And a lot of their stuff is very like avant-garde, nonsensical, but it's just there's something about it that's very like in your face, high editing, high like graphics, just everywhere. I highly recommend Sad World. I even believe like some like even more mainstreamy celebs have been on there. So yeah,
I'm gonna take a look, and I also highly recommend Xavier Renegade Angel. I think
Yeah.
that show also has those similar
Yeah.
qualities.
Mentioned a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have
So
to check that out.
so
Wonder Chosen.
oh, that's great. So with that, guys, I'm gonna bid everybody adieu. For those who are watching who did not subscribe yet, please subscribe and help us grow. We really appreciate you guys sticking around and watching this. You guys are the best. I can't wait for
guys.
subscribe. I can't wait for Tuesday. And patreon.com/loveandjules as always. And click that bell and give a like. So thank you guys so much. I'm going
More
to
updates soon.
more
Thank
updates
you.
soon. Take care.